And then in the chat, please introduce yourselves and let us know where you're chiming in from today and
Sure.
how you're connected to the VBA, friend of the VBA. Great. All right. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today to our VBA Conservation Conversation, which is an opportunity to learn about the fantastic work that's happening across our state in the big broad umbrella of conservation and ecology. Today, I'm so happy to welcome Jason Hill, who's a quantitative ecologist with the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. He directs the Mountain Birdwatch program, which is a long-running community science monitoring program of montane bird populations in the northeastern United States. Jason's work generally combines quantitative ecology, hierarchical Bayesian modeling, long-term data sets to investigate how climate change and human behavior impacts wild populations of critters. Strong emphasis on collaborative community science and conservation. Jason is originally from Iowa. He earned his MS in ecology from UConn, PhD in ecology from Penn State. And a very cool fact about Jason, which I'd love to hear more about over a beer sometime, would be his early research in Maui, working on one of the endangered honey creepers right before they went extinct. Which sounds like it was a super informative experience for him that continues to impact his work to this day, I think would be fair to say. So thanks so much, everybody, for coming. And Jason, I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I have to do a program sometime um about the Pouli. Um yeah. Mhm. How's that? Everyone, can you see full screen slide? All right. You're welcome to verbally interrupt me. I've got multiple monitors going, so you're welcome to verbally interrupt me at any time. I'm likely to miss text. I don't care. Rather have a conversation than a soliloquy about this topic. So yeah, as Manny mentioned, I did my master's research with salt marsh sparrows, which is always where I like to start with talking about mountains, because mountains are this easy system where it's like, yeah, that's up there, that's out of sight, out of mind, that's something going on over there, and most of us don't live up there, and it's not closer to our heart. So, sea levels in New England have risen by like a foot since 1900. They're projected to rise another foot by 2050 and another 1 to 2 feet beyond that foot by the end of this century. And it's a difficult place to live next to the ocean, especially for species like this, the salt marsh sparrow, which I did my master's work with at UConn, as Manny said. This is a species that breeds on the ground in these salt marshes between Carolinas and Maine, because that's all there is out there. And the salt marsh is such a halic environment that the salt kills woody vegetation. It's just basically Spartina alterniflora grassland, and these birds nest on the ground. So they're incredibly susceptible to flooding of the nests. Now, this species has declined by like 80–90% perhaps since the 1970s. They've got a lot of things working against them. But one of those big causes of decline is flooding-induced mortality of nests. Because the nests are on the ground, females lay, generally speaking, this is great simplification, but lay their eggs, start their clutches right after a full moon tide, which tends to be a little bit higher. The marsh goes underwater, boom, females initiate egg laying and carry out that nest, hopefully fledge the young just before the next full tide. If they miss that timing up, or if there's a big storm event with rain and the marsh floods prematurely, then the whole nest, as you can see in this photo, is washed away. Those chicks drowned. You go out to the salt marsh and there's no grass visible, and there's just dozens and dozens of chicks just floating across the surface of the marsh, who will drown or die from edema from salt intake into their systems. So some friends and I from grad school, we put our mathematical minds together, developed a model to predict sea level rise under different climate change scenarios, and basically predicted how long into the future, are you going to have salt marshes that are above the water level for 24 days to allow salt marsh sparrows to complete a nest cycle? And we estimate this species is not going to be able to reproduce after the next 30 years. And we predict they're going to be extinct in 40 years after a decade of adults flying around looking for places that are high enough above the sea level to nest unsuccessfully. So we predict this will be one of the very first species to directly go extinct due to climate change directly. Obviously, it's not just wildlife that are going to be impacted by these effects. These maps show expanded areas likely to flood if sea levels continue to rise in the coming decades, threatening communities and obviously vital economic infrastructure in New York City and other places. From a human perspective, some of the most vulnerable at-risk neighborhoods are adjacent to these areas. So with New York City, for example, 2/3 of the most socially vulnerable communities live in or adjacent to these flooded areas here. It's really interesting to see that it's private insurance industry that are driving regulatory changes and on-the-ground changes more so than coordinated government action. You have, especially cities like Miami, Florida, the private insurance industry is looking ahead and seeing the billions of dollars required for investments in seawalls and other infrastructure to prevent buildings from being destroyed by rising sea levels. And their changes to their policy and increases in premiums are what's driving private businesses and homeowners to make changes. Ditto in California, where you have some swaths of San Diego, other places where the entire home insurance industry is just pulled out. And as a homeowner, you just can't find homeowner insurance for those areas that are deemed too risky. So all driven by private insurance, interestingly. Yeah, it's getting warmer. If you didn't notice, if you did notice that, welcome to planet Earth, I guess. Right now we're like 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages, 1.4 something. And 2024, I think, was the hottest year on record. The last 3 years have been the hottest 3 years on record, the last decade of the blah, blah, blah. In New England here, temperatures have increased by like 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 120 some years, and they're expected to increase in a moderate scenario by 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit mean temperature by the end of the century. It's going to get warmer, to say the least. So to put that in the real terms, Vermont, we average something like 4 days a year where temperatures statewide are on average over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. By 2050, we're projected to have about 25 days a year that are going to be over 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the state. That's real implications for our most socially and economically vulnerable Vermonters, those who are least likely to have access to air conditioning, and those who are more likely to work outside during summer. There is no climate and economic signal, #war in the Middle East, to suggest these patterns are going to diminish in the century to come. These changes already are. They will continue to have impacts on our flora and fauna. See projected increases in temperature for New England and what our climate's going to look like in the century. It's going to be a very different place to be. Most species obviously aren't as geographically, physically restricted as salt marsh sparrows, confined to this narrow strip of land between upland habitat and the ocean. And for species that are mobile, or they're not restricted to wetlands or cliffs, things that aren't capable of physically moving with climate change, those organisms are going to be moving across the landscape to stay within their preferred climate envelope. The alternative is to stay in place and evolve some type of adaptation that allows you to compete in that place, switch food items to compete with newly introduced species, or you shift where you persist. So it looks like the strategy of moving in response to climate change rather than adapting in place is much more common. Indeed, more than half of the world's species that have been studied so far are already on the move, and this rate of movement, how far they're moving, is increasing each year. It's evidence to be range shifts and range contractions. These shifts are primarily driven by changing temperatures and land clearing practices associated with industrial agriculture. as other human modifications to the landscape. But most of these shifts are in direction consistent with climate change. Those are the blue arrows. That's the percentage of the species whose shifts upslope or towards the poles are consistent with rising temperatures, basically. You see that species that are already at the top of the mountain or species that are already closer to the North Pole are those species that are more likely to be shifting than species at the bases of mountains or at the species towards the equator. There are red arrows too that show the proportion of species that are shifting against climate change. And I should also say that climate change is happening faster in mountains. On average, mountains are warming twice the rate of global background rate, and mountain tops are warming about 5 times the global rate, 5 times the global average rate. So it's as you go up in elevation and up in latitude, the relative rate of climate change is happening faster. Lots of denialists like to point to the species that are represented by those red arrows to argue that the threat from climate change to flora and fauna is less severe than scientists like myself state they are. And I don't think that opinion is supported by the preponderance or evidence that says otherwise. I think we can confidently say at this point that every single species on this planet is affected directly or indirectly by climate change. And I'm actually going to show you some species that are those red arrow species towards the end of this talk that I think you'll agree are definitely affected by climate change. It is correct to say that some species will benefit from climate change, and invasive species are a great example of that. Compared to native species in that same part of the world, invasive species are expanding their range more than 100-fold faster than the native species in that same area. There will be winners and losers, absolutely. I'm going to just point out some fun examples from this. At this point, we have literally thousands of individual studies of different organisms to show how climate shift and range shifts and diet shifts, physiological adaptations are consistent with climate change across every group of organism on every continent. These are just examples that are representative of those patterns. This is data from American pica, cool legomorph from out in Great Basin area of the Western United States. You have, what is that? 200 meters of upslope movement from the first half of the 1900s when people kept records, started keeping records on these species, to 2008. And almost half of that upslope movement for North American pica occurred just over that last decade from 1998 to 2008. And that's an important point. The rate that we're seeing species move northward and upslope, it's not linear. It's not the same year after year. That rate is actually increasing. It's getting faster and more dramatic every year. These are cool species because they defecate in the same place, and they're really easy to track where a colony is active and to find where they're moving up. Another cool example of how range shifts and interactions play out in real space. This is a study from Freeman in the Southern Mountains in Peru. So you can see they went back 30 years later to these same mountains where researchers had misnetted birds back in the 1980s, and they went back to see what species were still there, what species had shifted. Lower elevation species like this common scaleback ampered, they expanded their ranges. So they are species that looks like they're succeeding from climate change, right? And they're moving upslope. Mid-elevation species like the barbet here moved upslope, but overall saw like almost 70% reduction in their range. So as they're adapting to climate change, they're actually becoming more vulnerable to future climate change because they're moving up that pyramidal shaped mountain. As they move up, cooler temperatures, but there's physically less and less area to occupy, and they're all squeezed into. So more vulnerable, even paradoxically, as they're adapting to climate change. And then some species at the top of those forested mountains in the 1980s, like the variable ant stripe, they're just gone. They're just not there anymore. They moved to other forested, higher elevation mountains. You don't just see those patterns elevationally, you see them latitudinally. This is winter bird count data from Audubon. These are the species that have moved most since the 1960s. During winter counts, they're all species moving north following temperature or west following precipitation gradients. The one exception of these 20 species that move the most is the house finch, which most of you know is a species native to the western United States that through illegal pet trades and release has been extensively released in the eastern United States since the 1950s and beyond, and has been a great example of invasion dynamics, a species that has really populated huge areas after those initial releases. So House Ventura is pointing to the east, but the other movement's happening to the north and the west. The Audubon figure there, that's the average shift north for the 305 bird species that are abundant in the winter bird count data. So I'll skip past in the interest of time, but we'll just say that you can see these patterns in all kinds of different organisms, including insect communities here. These are data from the Alps in Germany, showing upslope movement shifts in bees and flowerflies and beetles. That's where they have long-term data sets over there. Collectively, all of the invertebrate groups in the study moved up more than 100 meters over slope. These are some of the most extreme examples. And some groups of invertebrates moved down slope. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but on average, most of those invertebrate species have been shifting upslope. Ditto with Arctic fishes. Hard not to pay attention to the economic importance of shifting commercial fishery stocks here in Gulf of Maine. You see, as water temperatures get warmer, species like Arctic fishes in the purple that need very cold water to successfully breed, those species are shifting north and being pushed up by species that can breed in relatively warmer waters. Same time, you have increased demand from fisheries on those fish as it's ice out for longer periods each year. Those fishing vessels are able to travel further north, stay there for extended periods of time, and to also fish those stocks longer as they move and retreat to the north. I could just say that again, literally every species you can think of, everything in here on this photo and more has evidence of adaptations to climate change. The majority of freshwater fish species in the world show upstream movements in response to climate change. We have in Europe, 60% of butterfly species have shifted their ranges to the north. 2.5% have species of butterfly in Europe have shifted to the south. Example after example, supported by data sets. We can go on and on about this. This is a cool result. I think it's because we think in terms of direct effects often, but there are some really cool human-mediated effects from climate change that will have on wildlife. And here's an example from my research. So we have a number of tick species, including the Gulf Coast tick, that are moving northward in the United States in response to climate change, but also basically, human suburbanization of the landscape and creating forest edges. So in Canada, for example, where Lee's tuning in from, we have black-legged ticks, deer ticks, which are moving northwards at a rate of like 20 miles a year, right? Being dispersed by large mammals and birds. So you have climate change and human modification landscape facilitating the northward expansion of species like Gulf Coast ticks, Lone Star ticks, black-legged ticks, others. And because of that, more and more people are spraying their yards systemically with pesticides to try to control those ticks. In our study, we actually went out here to a couple hundred properties and monitored invertebrates on those properties before they sprayed commercially for ticks and afterwards. And a single spraying event wiped out about 30% of the spiders on those backyard properties, 30% of the butterflies and moths, 25% of the true bugs, and the bees and wasps from a single spraying event. So those are how climate change also has indirect effects on organisms as well. It's kind of an interesting thing about. Shifting back to plants. Plants obviously don't move across the landscape the way that organisms with legs do, but they nonetheless move. And there's lots of studies demonstrating that plant communities are shifting to the north and to the west, including most of the tree species in the eastern United States you see on the right. Every year it gets more and more favorable, the northern part of the range for that species, and they produce more and more seeds. In the southern periphery of the range, it gets harder and harder to survive. You may have species of individual trees that are hanging on for decades in the south, which aren't producing any viable offspring though, until those adult trees die. And that's how trees and other plants shift, is through seed dispersal effectively and adult mortality. So plant community shifting, Closer to home example here, 12,000 years ago, New England, southeast Canada was spruce fir forest in our valleys. In that last 12,000 years, the pollen record shows has been steadily replacement of spruce fir by northern movement of northern hardwoods as it becomes warmer. And we think of spruce fir forests as just being our mountaintop forests here in New England, at least. But, that's relatively last 5,000 years that's a phenomenon. Number of researchers have estimated what that's going to look like in the future. And those studies have estimated that we'll probably, over the next 2 centuries, lose more than half of the remaining spruce fir forest as the pattern of hardwoods replacing spruce fir upslope, as that process continues, but just accelerates. So those organisms that already live at the top of the mountains, where are you going to go? Right? You're going to go further north towards Canada? Sure. But after you get past Mount Washington, you're traveling down in elevation to go further north. So double-edged sword. So we can expect to see some dramatic changes for animals living in the mountains. And that's exactly what you see in these models. These are species where anywhere you see red is where they are currently a breeding species, but are expected to be lost from the end of this century under a modest climate change scenario, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yellow is where those species may be maintained. That's basically all of the spruce fir birds, any of the birds that live in mountains, going to be greatly diminished if they stay in those areas. On the other hand, we're going to lose all kinds of spruce fir species, but also species like the crossbills and grosbeaks and black-throated green warblers and razorbills and black-burnian warblers and spruce grouse and Philadelphia vireos. They're going to become Canadian and Alaskan endemics, most likely by the end of the century. Going to see all kinds of colonization, northward movement. It's going to be heyday for birders. Don't deny that. It's going to be an exciting time to be somebody with a pair of binoculars. But anywhere you see blue are areas that are expected to be colonized by the end of the century by these species moving north. We're talking field sparrow and worm-eating warbler and hooded warbler, cerulean warbler, blue-gray gnatcatcher, Carolina wren, you name it. It's going to be an exciting time. We're going to probably lose 30, 40 species of birds. We're going to probably gain 30, 40 species of birds as they move north. It's just the species we are responsible for are going to be shifting. These are what those models look like for one of the species that I monitor through Mountain Birdwatch. And, it's important to say these are just models. Obviously, I can't look with clear vision ahead 100 years. These models assume this species will be lost anywhere in red, white-throated sparrow, and that these animals can move across the landscape freely without physical barriers or competitive interactions, prohibiting them from occupying new spaces. So that's an ideal scenario, right? If we're going to understand how realistic those models are, though, if we need to change how we fundamentally think about how organisms respond to climate change, what they're physically capable of, then you have to have long-term data sets. As unsexy as that is, there's just no way around it. And that's where Mountain Birdwatch comes in. That's the program Mandy referenced that I coordinated for almost the last decade. It's a community science-driven effort where each year 100+ community scientists perform bird counts at fixed locations, 800 locations across the mountains of the Northeast United States every June during the breeding season. We focus on 10 species of birds you see in the upper left there, and red squirrel, which is a really important nest predator. But the vast majority of people count all the birds they're able to detect. So these community scientists have been going out since 2010, collecting the exact same data, the exact same locations on these randomly chosen locations. I'm going to focus on 3 of those species. I chose these 3 species for the rest of this talk because these are all restricted to the spruce fir zone during the breeding season, but they have very different life histories, and they overwinter in different parts of the Western Hemisphere. White-throated sparrows overwinter in the Southeast United States, bicknells in the Caribbean, and black-billed warbler in South America. That's important to remember. All these results are on our website, by the way, which is called State of Mountain Birds. But these are the annual trend estimates for each of these 3 species across the Mountain Birdwatch area. Those 800 locations from the Catskills up to Katahdin. They're obviously all declining. If you want to know if 14% decline per year is bad, imagine your retirement portfolio declining by 14% per year. It's pretty bad. Pretty bad. You'd be panicking, right? They are declining like most spruce fir bird species are in the northeastern United States. And those declines tend to be most severe in the Catskills, which are obviously the lowest latitudinally and elevational places that these species occupy in the Northeast. So Mountain Birdwatch tells us these three species are declining broadly and rapidly across our region. Are they declining though because they are just moving north into Canada out of the Mountain Birdwatch detection zone, so to speak? Or are they declining more like a puddle in a parking lot where they're just shrinking in from the edges and declining in place? Are they moving or declining in place? And one way to get at that question using Mountain Birdwatch data are dynamic occupancy models, which are really fun models, which allow us to, account for humans' imperfect ability to detect birds. That's important. But dynamic occupancy models predict, based on a long-term data set like Mountain Birdwatch from 2010 onwards, where has this species been in the past and where is it not presently at? That's local extinction or extirpation prediction. And it also enables us to predict colonization events. Where has the species not been in 2010, but has been consistently showing up over the last 2 or 3 years? And we can ask, are those rates changing with time? So you want to understand where these species have shifted to, you have to understand where they occurred in the Northeast in 2010. And that's what you see in this heat map here. And these results are so incredibly similar for Bicknell's thrush, black-polled warbler, white-throated sparrow. I'm just going to show a single figure representing those three species for the rest of the talk. This is occupancy probability in 2010. And as you can see here, this is basically a prediction of the spruce fir zone, to be honest. Brighter areas are those areas that are more likely to be occupied in 2010 by these three species. And you can see that diagonal band across the middle. So at lower latitudes, like 42 degrees north is the Catskills, and 46 degrees north is Katahdin, basically at Baxter State Park. So at low elevations, low latitudes, very low probability that the species is there. Likewise, at the very top of Katahdin, where it's basically rock and a few alpine plants, unlikely to have these species present there either because they're confined to the spruce fir forests, not the alpine zone. So again, basically a prediction of the spruce fir zone. All right, let's dive into the changes that we've detected since 2010 and talk about colonization first. Where are these three species showing up recently that they weren't present in 2010? The brightest areas in this plot are obviously in the top right corner there. That's where those species are most likely to colonize. That's in the north of the study area and at relatively higher elevations. Okay, that's consistent with species moving upslope and moving to the north in response to climate change. Okay, however, the rate of colonization is declining. In other words, every year, these three species colonize fewer and fewer sites in the northeastern United States. And that's true across all elevations, and that's true across all latitudes. The rate is very similar. If these species were shifting their ranges to the north, just everybody, let's all go to Canada, everybody. You'd expect to see that red line be flat, maybe increasing, but you definitely expect to see that green line, higher elevations and higher latitudes, to be increasing. That is not what we see. This is better evidence of species that are simply declining everywhere, ubiquitously, with contracting ranges like that shrinking puddle in the parking lot on a hot day, rather than species that are shifting their ranges to the north, right? You could have a pattern of declining colonization because every site is already colonized effectively and there's no new sites left. But you know from the previous figure of those high rates of population declines each year for these three species, it's just the opposite. There are more and more sites available to be colonized each year, but these species are colonizing fewer of those sites each year. So let's talk about where those species have disappeared from over the last 15 years. They disappeared from previously occupied low elevation sites. Low elevation sites may have cut it 20 years ago, but they don't cut it now. The different colored lines represent different, latitudinal bands. So the blue line is Catskills and Maine up top, and or is the green line. But obviously those are credible intervals. They overlap. So there's some difference among latitude, but clearly elevation is just driving this pattern. Extinction is most likely happening at those lower elevation sites, and high elevation sites are generally speaking more secure. And unlike colonization, which is slowing down though, I forgot to put in the figure for this, but the local extinction rate is actually increasing. So fewer and fewer sites every year become colonized, and more sites blink off every single year, and that rate is increasing. So putting it all together, these are telltale signs of species that are undergoing rapid population declines that are shrinking, not shifting their breeding ranges. These are species not showing strong signs of adaptations. You might argue that these species belong in those red arrows that you saw on that previous figure, but you're probably thinking that's probably not a fair assessment of these species, right? They're disappearing from sites much faster than they're colonizing new sites. They are not moving up or north anywhere close at a pace fast enough to keep up with climate change. Here you see, these are data for white-throated sparrow. They've disappeared in the last 16 years from 330 formerly occupied sites in the spruce fir forest in the Northeast. And they've colonized a whopping 13 new sites over that time. Lopsided to say the least. Again, these results are similar for blackpoll and bignells. These are species, again, with different life histories. They overwinter in different parts of the Western Hemisphere. And yet these patterns are remarkably consistent across these species and yellow-bellied flycatcher and other spruce fir specialists monitored by Mountain Birdwatch. This suggests a coordinated contraction of the Northeast spruce fir bird community rather than species-specific responses. The entire assemblage of spruce fir birds is changing in the same direction. So that is very strong evidence in and of itself that climate change or processes occurring on the breeding grounds are driving these declines and contractions. That's not to say that these species also don't face pressures from climate change and other factors throughout the rest of their lives. They certainly do. So it's possible that these species are not going to be present in New England by the end of the century. And then a number of other authors have published studies predicting that that is going to be the case. Hopefully, during that time, we're able to learn about the mechanisms driving these changes and what's possible, how rapidly species are able to change, and what's possible for them to change, to learn about the process so we could potentially interject in management for other species. Those possible mechanisms that could be driving these changes. Remember, unlike salt marsh sparrows, these species aren't going to drown from rising sea levels. There is some mechanism operating behind the scenes. It could be changes in the quality of habitat, increased competition from the upslope movement of other species moving up into the higher elevations, and there's just less food because there's more birds competing for it. Could be shifts in the breeding phenology. Maybe the insects aren't as abundant at the time of year when these species of birds like to produce their young, and that's changing, and the birds aren't changing appropriately. Or maybe there's increased nestling mortality from those. I talked about the predictions for how many hot days we're going to have here in Vermont, maybe 25 days over 90 degrees statewide average by 2050. Maybe we'll have we're having already higher nestling mortality rate from extreme heat days. And maybe that's one of the factors driving these population declines. Documenting what those declines are is not going to be easy because these processes are likely not the same from Katahdin to Catskills. They likely are different across the New England landscape. It's going to mean like individual studies, but like at lots of different locations to understand locally and latitudinally where those changes are and what the population pressures are. Not difficult. Not easy by any stretch of the imagination. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Happy to answer any questions about any of that. I know that's a ton of information all at you at once, but yeah.
That was awesome, Jason. So much information and incredible amount of work. I just want to say that long-term data is the sexiest data. You said it was not.
There
I
you go.
disagree.
Thank you. I
I
appreciate that.
disagree. Definitely the sexiest with the mindset of long-term.
Tell that to the funders.
Seriously, I feel your
Yeah.
pain. So if anyone wants to start off the conversation, have any questions for Jason about specific parts of the talk, feel free to chime in. I think there's a small enough group of us here today that you could just unmute yourself and have bring up some topics. I have one to get us going. Thinking about the different vital rates that could be impacting the population sizes of these different species. I think to your work in Hawaii and the impact of avian malaria, what the general thought is for the introduction of new diseases and how they're going to be affecting our passerines, with under these different climate scenarios. And if that's something you guys are thinking about at all. I mean, I know this is a huge puzzle to kind of unravel, but.
Yeah, yeah. Introduction of avian diseases, but also thinking about like as we've modified the landscape here and increased dramatically the number of white-tailed deer, we've seen white-tailed deer move into areas previously occupied by moose, but now compete them for browse and forage, but also transmit parasites, bring parasites to them, which are fatal to moose. So you're seeing not just increases in diseases, the potential for spread, but also parasitic interactions across species that could be detrimental. The tick thing is a good example of how one species increasing might cause us to change our management of the landscape that has detrimental impacts on other species, very similar to disease. And I'm not doing any work with that. It's definitely on the minds of lots and lots of people, but it's also very challenging to get at a landscape level disease monitoring of visuals dispersed across the landscape. And tracking those changes is very, very difficult. I'm a part of a group called Project Itch that we're doing that for ticks here in New England, where we contribute all of our ticks to this lab, University of Massachusetts, where there's a professor there that does all the disease testing for every tick disease possible in the United States. So we could be some of the first detectors of those new diseases, but in general, I'd say that's not common. There are not a lot of people thinking about those emerging diseases.
Yeah, well, maybe the hantavirus situation will change what that conversation looks like going forward. Okay, anyone else? Still feel free to unmute and chime in.
Yeah, definitely super interesting. I mean, I've read the State of the Mountain Birds report and stuff, so yeah, but great to have sort of the overview of it, and definitely can confirm that they're not moving north. Because on our mountain birdwatch surveys, particularly in Cape Breton, which would have the same habitat, like we also have a lot of overlap with industrial forests in New Brunswick. But we previously did mountain birdwatch on the forest in Cape Breton, which is entirely a national park. And we ended up stopping, for Bicknell's thrush at least, stopping those surveys in 2017 because we were detecting 0 Bicknell's thrush. So it was like a gradual decline. So that idea of, the northward, are they going north? It's like we're not finding them. And we still have to look at the rest of the birds. I'm trying to do a Canadian sort of version of the State of Mountain Birds for our data set next year. So interested to see what kind of comes out for the other species, but our preliminary results for Bicknell's thrush in New Brunswick, in the New Brunswick data, is also, like about a 4.6% per year decline for Bicknell's thrush there. So it's, like the declines, and particularly like hermit thrush was looking like it's all kind of preliminary. We've just been starting to play with it, but those definitely some declines there in at least some of the species.
Hermit thrush is a species, Amy, as you know, we monitor from Mountain Birdwatch, and it's a hardwood species mostly that does in New England overlap into the lower elevation spruce fir. And you on one hand, you'd say, well, that's a species that's going to benefit from declining other thrush numbers. Like Bicknell's thrush, as they tank, it should create some space for ground foraging, low nesting thrush-like birds. And I don't know why, but that's not the pattern we see. We see hermit thrush precipitously declining also. Not able to make the jump from existence based out of the hardwoods to switching food and whatever else in the spruce fir, but they're not doing it. Your point about the upslope movement, I think a lot of us, and myself included, I know I do. When I think about upslope movement, I literally think of it like people getting on a subway train and like going to the next stop. Like, and that's probably not how organisms respond to climate change. Blackpoll warblers don't come back to Mount Mansfield each year. And we all say, okay, let's all move 2 meters upslope. I'll move my territory that way. You move in behind me, but if that guy's got to move up first, okay? Everybody go. That isn't how it happens. Those male birds likely stay in place, occupy those territories, and just die. And every year they're just less likely to attract mates. It could also be that female birds, which disperse their sex, and juvenile in the offspring are more likely to move upslope to look for future breeding territories and to look for mates, leaving the loser males at the bottom, relative to the bottom of the mountains, less likely each year to be mated. But it's unlikely like the whole population, like individual birds are not like moving up. There aren't any studies I know of that have tried to track an interannual upslope movement of birds, and I can understand why. It'd be so tough, like color marking individual birds, territory mapping them so you at the center of their territory. So difficult. But I think it's much more likely that those birds just stay in place, and then just like the trees shifting to the north, they just die out. It's just each year the birds at the top and birds further north have more and more evolutionary fitness. They just pump out more offspring.
I've got a question that was about one of the slides. It was like showing declining lines, and you were saying you would have thought these were going to be going up, and that's what I thought. And I didn't follow. I lost you there. It was like, I don't know, 3 slides back.
The colonization. The colonization.
Yeah. The colonization. Can you explain that again, maybe?
So yeah, the colonization is predicting where those species weren't 15 years ago, but where they are now in the last, I've used the last 3 years, where they are showing up in the last 3 year period. If white-throated sparrow in New England is moving upslope, then we would expect to see that, I think top green line, I think it was, you'd expect to see that flatter increasing, meaning that higher elevation sites and higher latitudinal sites, as the species shifts, would be the sites that are more likely to be colonized. You wouldn't expect to see lower elevation sites more likely to be colonized each year if it's upslope movement due to climate change. And we don't see that pattern. You see just everywhere, every elevation and every latitude, just declining probability each year. And the rate is increasing with time, that they're just less and less likely to find new sites to occupy anywhere. And because the species is rapidly declining, there are more and more available sites to colonize each year. It's not like trying to squeeze into some hip neighborhood to find an apartment and there's no place left to rent. There's just empty apartments everywhere. They're just not being colonized.
Because it's just not working like the subway stop model that you just outlined. Like that's just not how it works.
I think although I don't think, like I was saying, I don't think there's any real data set that's tracked individual birds and how they respond to climate change year after year to show whether individual birds are actually moving upslope. I think that's most people's best guess, is that's just not how these birds are programmed.
Mm-hmm.
And you wouldn't want, I mean, thinking of it like it'd be a tough model for any organism to be jumping around every year based on interannual variation in weather effectively to them, right? And these climates are relatively stable over the lifespan of an organism. Your best bet is to use some, take your best guess and then just stick it out. It's going to be colder, warmer, colder, warmer. You don't want to be moving every other year. That has a lot of costs associated with it itself. So to me, it suggests that there are a number of factors driving the population declines of those species, and that they're simply not able to, or or it's they're not able to adapt to climate change as rapidly as climate change is happening. Or through evolutionary time, that a better strategy has always been to just stick it out. Yeah, it might be getting a little colder, might be getting a little warmer last 5 to 10 years, but just stick it out there, you'll probably be better. And, going back to those early temperature figures I showed, that strategy may have worked well 200 years ago.
Right.
But where temperatures are increasing as fast as they are, that may be not an adaptive strategy.
Not a good strategy. So there's something there's not a clear parallel between then the move north, which is happening, and the move up, which is not necessarily like that adaptation can happen when you're talking about latitudinal changes, but not about elevation.
Yeah, and it's important to say that I'm just talking about the population as a whole. We obviously know from evolutionary theory there are going to be lots of individuals variation in their strategies. There very well may be like a disperser genotype that is trying to do exactly what we're talking about. That is moving upslope, that is moving north, that's breaking the pattern, and that through evolutionary time, we'd expect maybe those individuals to be the ones that survive and pump out more offspring. So, but at the whole, at the moment, that's not what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But for a number of those species, why they're tanking, like hermit thrush and like white-throated sparrow everywhere in the eastern United States, I really don't have a solid single answer for what it is. And the only thing that connects those species is that they all breed in high elevation habitats.
Right.
Where climate change is happening at 5 times the rate that the rest of the world is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Probably have time for one more question if anyone wants to chime in.
Happy to talk about any of the other animals, moose, or anything else that I referenced earlier in the talk too. And birds get a lot of attention. I should say, a lot of those models, those range prediction models are obviously, they're based on very simple assumptions that those species are just freely able to move. And there's no way that we can account for, as Naomi was asking about, introduced diseases or expansion. And there's no way those models can accommodate any kind of defensive way invasive species. Like thinking about transformation of the landscape. Japanese honeysuckle and buckthorns, barberry, or spotted lantern flies, hemlock woolly algae. Those types of invasive interactions are thought to be, they're increasing, and we're expecting to have more and more of those species every year in New England. Every year as our climate becomes warmer and more similar to other parts of the world where we receive a lot of shipped goods from people moving to and from, we can just expect more spotted lantern fly type invasions in years to come. It's anyone's guess how those species put eventually. Could be it becomes a new novel food source for one of those species and allows them to persist in place longer than would be without it. On the other hand, it could be something that's fiercely competitive and is a detrimental effect to those species. This is one of those things we're going to look back in 50 years with like some clear patterns. It's like DBT all over. It's like, oh yeah, that would have been good to know 3 decades ago. So it's why it's incredibly important now to try to, through long-term monitoring, document these patterns. We may not be able to make sense of it at this moment, but hopefully through time, we're able to look back at some patterns and say, yeah, short distance migrants did a lot better than long distance migrants. So species that overwinter in human modified landscapes like white-throated sparrows, not doing well. It'll take long-term data sets to figure that stuff out.
Any other questions from folks for Jason before we wrap it up here? All right. Well, I wanted to say thanks again to Jason for making the time to share this.
Thanks.
I mean, it's just a wealth of information, and you told a really good story. Yeah, and yeah, let's get that sexy long-term data set funded to continue this work. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, you guys. I appreciate everybody chiming in on a beautiful day when it's sunny outside to learn about some science and listen to Jason share his work. So thanks so much.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.